Welcome to the ECAPS Watch podcast. I'm Kevin Houlihan, CEO at Workflow Services, and I could not be more excited today to be joined by former Representative Ron Kind. Ron Kind served Wisconsin's 3rd Congressional District for 26 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he sat on the powerful Ways and Means Committee and its Health and Trade subcommittees. In 2022, he introduced the ECAPS Act to the House, legislation that continues to influence the pharmacy industry and inspire your favorite podcast here. Today, Ron is a senior counsel in Arnold and Porter's legislative and public policy practice. A fun fact for the audience, Representative Kind and I were both raised in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We both attended the same high school, and he was the commencement speaker at my high school graduation. So go Rangers.
Yeah, go Rangers.
So, former Rep Kind, I have so many interesting thoughts and love to hear your perspective about this ECAPS legislation. I kind of think you're sort of the grandfather of the legislation. You originally introduced it and continues to live on in its kind of third instance. Can you tell me how it started, why you got there, what you saw, what the idea was?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, John. But first, it's kind of neat we share that connection. You know, Logan grads, I was able to speak at your commencement ceremony, hopefully not discourage you kids too much going out in the real world and going on to great things like you're doing today. So it's a pleasure to be on your podcast. And yeah, you know, it's an important piece of legislation. It should have been done a long time ago. I was the lead author on the Ways and Means Committee, which has exclusive jurisdiction over it, which was nice in order to be able to work in a bipartisan fashion to build support for it. But really, the genesis of the idea came from me traveling around Western Wisconsin, my large rural district, stopping in and seeing the pharmacists, seeing the job that they were doing. They are, in so many instances, the first line of healthcare and healthcare outreach in our communities, especially the rural areas. And the premise of the legislation is to be able to expand their scope of testing and services and still get reimbursed under Medicare, since that is the primary point of contact for many citizens throughout the country, let alone in Wisconsin. So it would make sense. Of course, whenever you try to disrupt the status quo in the healthcare field, there's always an equal and opposite reaction. We can talk a little bit more about the opposition that we were facing in light of the legislation, but it still makes sense. And when I was leaving Congress, was it 2 years ago now, I handed it off to another member of the Ways and Means Committee so he could continue the effort of building support, working its way through committee, and hopefully getting fair consideration on both the House and the Senate floor.
Yeah. So was there something when you were out in the communities that you saw? Like, is there a story or something you remember about someone getting access to care in a pharmacy, or why pharmacy? Do you have a personal connection to that?
Well, it really, you know, during the height of COVID, obviously, that was the only point of service that a lot of people were receiving was from their local pharmacists under the natural precautions. And so some of the scope was expanded out of necessity. And the fact that the pharmacists were able to stand up and perform that without a hitch, I think convinced a lot of members, including myself, that we ought to be making this permanent as far as some of the testing and the treatment that can take place at pharmacists. I mean, let's face it, you've got over 200 rural hospitals that are going out of business in recent years. The passage of the big, beautiful bill this summer is going to put more financial strain on these rural healthcare providers. Many of them are operating at less than 1% margin. So the fact that there's going to be close to $1 trillion worth of cuts coming out of Medicaid is going to put, I think, tremendous financial pressure on a lot of rural hospitals. And but for the pharmacists being able to step in and try to fill a little bit of this primary treatment, you know, first treatment needs out there, I don't know where people are going to go or how they're going to get service. And some of the testing that the legislation would call for are basic stuff for flu and respiratory RSV, some strep throat, some COVID-19 testing, and then the treatment along those similar lines. But right now, we lack Medicare reimbursement on a permanent basis, and that's what the legislation would call for. And I think the proven track record that pharmacists have given in recent years show that they can handle this, that they're not only trustworthy, but they're safe. And I think that's the primary concern for those opposed, is whether or not this is a safe avenue for pharmacists to be taking with their patients. I believe there is. I think that judgment has been rendered many years ago, and now we just have to convince more members of Congress.
Well, and the evidence is out there. It's so confounding that in some states you can have folks that have commercial insurance or Medicaid go into the pharmacy and get treatment, but the Medicare folks are not allowed to, right? It just seems upside down.
Yeah, and the irony is one of the main sources of opposition is the American Medical Association. They were one of the main opponents to the creation of Medicare to begin with, and now they're trying to protect their exclusive carve-out in Medicare reimbursements to the exclusion of these pharmacists. But the reality is, close to 9 out of 10 Americans live within 5 miles of
Hmm.
their nearest pharmacy. And so it's easy, it's convenient. And in healthcare, man, that makes all the difference in the world. Trying to make healthcare treatment options as easy and as convenient as you can. Otherwise, you're scheduling appointments with a primary care physician in a major hospital. You know those long wait periods. You have to travel long distances typically in order to get in and see them. Whereas you could just go down the street to your neighborhood pharmacist and have the same type of services being performed there. And it's only right then that we would adequately reimburse our pharmacists under Medicare for doing a good job.
Yeah, and the way that we see it is that everybody wins. The patient obviously wins because they get easier access to care. The insurance companies win because you're catching things earlier, and so you got a healthier population. I think the traditional providers, the doctors, win because they can spend their time on the more, the higher severity sorts of things, and everyone's practicing at the level of their license. And of course, the pharmacy wins because they can serve their communities in many ways, like they are today, but actually get recognized for it and kind of have more of a healthy business that can be a part of the community. So
And Jen, I noticed through the years too, in my position in Congress, of course, I served on the health subcommittee, so I was involved in a lot of these healthcare discussions throughout the years. But most of the major battles aren't really ideological. They're protecting reimbursement
mm,
streams. It's who gets reimbursed for what services and the overlap of that. And that's where things get really bogged down, quite a bit. And of course, the AMA, there's no one that knows how to play the game better than they do given their force and presence throughout the country. But the pharmacists, I thought, have a crucial role when it comes to primary care in our healthcare system. And to your point, I mean, the easier and the sooner you can make it easy for patients to get in and receive these very basic services, the healthier they'll remain. And major problems and complications don't develop, which would require more institutionalized in-hospital care, which drives up the cost for healthcare generally, but the premiums for everyone.
yeah. So this we couldn't agree more with all this. We think that the role of the pharmacy, and we can see it in many states, can expand even beyond this respiratory test or treatment. But you've got to walk before you can run, and so we'd love to see this pass forward first. But did you have that in mind when you introduced the legislation that pharmacies are not going to be doing CT scans in aisle 4 or whatever, but there's a bunch more stuff they can do. Do you see this as the first step to some of that, or how did you view the scope of the legislation originally?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's walk first, show that they've got the competency, they have the capability, and that is a safe method for healthcare delivery within our system. And that lays the foundation then for an expansion of some additional services. But man, obviously I use our local pharmacy in La Crosse too for my healthcare needs, and I go in there and there's always constant demand. I mean,
Mhm.
people rely upon that, and they feel safe in doing so. So I think it's a situation where the policymakers need to catch up with where the American people already are. And that is great trust with their local pharmacists. Many have a first name basis with them, that personal relationship.
Yeah.
And that's kind of nice to have too. When you have a pharmacist who know you, they kind of know your medical history and what you need, and being able to go in and consult with them from time to time. I think it alleviates a lot of the pressure that some of our hospitals are under today.
So what does it take to get the policymakers to catch up? Like what is from here to the end goal of actually getting this legislation passed and opening up access look like?
Well, I would always, when I would be traveling around my congressional district in Western Wisconsin, pop into the pharmacists and encourage them to get in touch with their representatives. Of course, me, I mean, they already know where I was on it, but they're U.S. senators. They've got two of them. And I know the pharmacy association out in D.C. are encouraging their pharmacist members to do that type of political outreach, just to educate members of the House and the Senate, invite them into their store when they're around, and many of them will be traveling around their state and districts, getting them in-house to see what the scope of the pharmacist's practices right now. That helps the education effort. And then they've had some drives, postcard letter, otherwise, from the actual patients contacting their policymakers and telling them how crucial it is that they're receiving these services at their local pharmacy. That leaves a big impact, obviously, on policymakers when they're hearing directly from their bosses, their constituents, as far as what the needs are and what can easily be addressed through a piece of legislation like this.
So this is the third time this legislation has been introduced, and it sounds like you're still kind of in touch with it and tracking it. What do you think the prospects are? Can you help me and the audience understand what it takes to actually get the bill passed from where we are today?
Yeah, you need committee support, obviously. Typically, it requires a hearing, so you receive some testimony on both sides, but hopefully there'll be more on the positive side coming before Congress and testifying. And that way members are able to ask questions of the so-called experts and dig in deeper with the legislation. And if the committee chair wants to move forward on the bill, they'll hold a vote in committee and then work with the leadership then to schedule a time for it to be considered for debate and for a vote on both the House and the Senate floor. But a lot of times these smaller healthcare packages, and this bill is relatively small in the grand scheme of things, they get included in larger healthcare packages. And that's what I was working on, to try to have this teed up so it could move when there was a larger healthcare package involving different bits and pieces, which would be appropriate to attach it to. But the other thing, too, that obviously is an important factor weighing in any type of legislation, let alone this, is what the Congressional Budget Office scores this bill in costing. What would be the impact on the budget? Will it be really expensive? Is there a possibility of finding offsets within the healthcare sector to help pay for this legislation? That can get kind of dicey because in order to find cuts in a different area, you're usually talking about someone else's reimbursement or funding stream, and then the politics get a lot rougher. But the overall cost of this bill hasn't been that great as far as the overall healthcare system is concerned. And the hardest thing that we had in trying to convince the Congressional Budget Office that they needed to consider was, sure, there'd be short but small upfront costs of extending these services, but it's the back end cost that you can save by removing the need for more acute care settings, for instance, through more complicated healthcare treatment options. But it's very hard to convince the Congressional Budget Office that you can actually score the back end savings of a bill like this. They usually, I swear to God, all of them were from Missouri, the show me state. Show me the cost in my hand before I give you any credit. But just intuitively, and you talk to any doctor, I mean, if you've got testing for respiratory illness or for flu or strep even, if you can deal with that up front and take care of it before it becomes a major issue for that patient, you're saving a ton of costs, by doing that. But it's hard given the CBO rules and how they so-called score these pieces of legislation.
Yeah, so it sounds like you think there's the likely path to passage on this is being paired with other healthcare legislation. And if you can look into your crystal ball, and maybe there's no crystal ball that's got any sort of visibility in it at all right now, if you had to make predictions or see a path forward, any ideas for the audience, your unique perspective that you would bring, what should we be looking out for?
Yeah, there was a really nice healthcare package that was put together at the end of last year, and it came very close to being passed. Unfortunately, this bill wasn't included because it was just recently been reintroduced again. But, having talked to the main sponsors right now, Brad Schneider, he's a representative from Illinois. I handed the bill off to him so he could continue the charge in the Ways and Means Committee. I know he's working it real hard, too, and working with a Republican colleague of his on Ways and Means to see if they can move that. But generally, if you can have a legislative package or something like this that has bipartisan support, both Republicans and Democrats supporting it, that usually is a good indication to the leadership that this is something that should be seriously considered or perhaps attached to a larger healthcare package. Because the last thing they want is major controversy or some excuse for some senator, a lone senator, to hold up the package over on the Senate, since their rules are a little bit different there. And then working with the administration to try to get their buy-in too, so you don't get a threat for a veto from the White House.
Yeah, well, that's, I've been tracking the sponsorship in both the House and Senate pretty closely, and it is remarkable how it's just a very steady wave of new sponsors that are super bipartisan. It's almost always one for one, every single week, and 4 new last week in the House. What does it take to get that kind of bipartisan support, and how special and unique is that in this country today?
I always operated under that fashion, John, and try to keep a one-to-one parity on bills I introduce. Republican, Democrat, they team up and then co-sponsor together. That way you maintain balance. That way you show it's not just some partisan talking point that you're trying to push through the legislation. And leadership also appreciates that. So when they're serious about getting something done, they see that it does have bipartisan support. But I won't lie to you. I mean, today's environment is tough. I mean, it's almost like a hostile work environment with the government shutdown right now, just how polarized things have been. The trust factor is really diminished in Congress. That's the coin of the realm in Congress, is developing those personal relationships across the aisle, developing that trust so you can work on various pieces of legislation together. And that's sorely lacking in today's environment. You have too many elected officials who are just there to push buttons, to get people riled up. They try to claim that the opposite party is an existential threat to our very existence, that they're the evil incarnate. And when that atmosphere prevails, it's very tough then to get bipartisan legislation to be moving through the normal channels. But this is a bill still, as you point out, has received remarkable balance in support from both parties, which I think bodes well. And the lead authors are very credible people, respected, given their political acumen and their depth of knowledge. That helps too, where the legislation emanated.
So with the kind of growing support that it's getting, I think there's almost 100 supporters across the House and Senate today, super bipartisan. Does that offer some sort of special attributes? Can this be an oasis in this hostile environment? Is there enough of a magnetic pull there to say, hey, here's something that we can do that is very popular, that we can actually get done, that serves the community, that everyone agrees on? Does that give us even a little bit more hope, maybe?
Yeah, Speaker Johnson right now has been complaining about the extension of the so-called Affordable Care Act premium tax credits. And he says, that's not the problem as far as affordability. And he's right in that regard. There are cost drivers within the healthcare system that really do need to be addressed. And Congress isn't really paying too close attention to it. The premium tax credits are kind of a Band-Aid over a larger wound within the healthcare system. Why is healthcare so expensive? Why is delivery so expensive? And this is an instance that you can point to saying, hey, not only is it convenient for your average patient, but it makes sense to allow pharmacists to expand their scope of service in this fashion, allow them to get reimbursed at the same time in order to save long-term costs and expense within the healthcare system. So if Speaker Johnson is serious about what he's saying, this would be a piece of legislation I would take to his doorstep and say, hey, we really do need some structural reforms in the healthcare system and not just more tax credits, which really don't address the underlying cost pressures that exist.
And do you know, is he aware of this? Are folks taking it to him and saying, hey, here's a solution that everyone agrees? Maybe it's not the only solution, but it's part of a path forward.
Most of the actions at the committee level right now, to be honest, in the subcommittee, trying to convince both sides, leadership on both sides in the committee, that this should be included in a healthcare package when one is being put together. And I know Representative Schneider has been making that case on both sides of the committee. You got Ranking Member Chairman Richie Neal, who I've had really good conversations about this bill on, and then you have Jason Smith, who's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee from Missouri. Obviously, many pharmacists in Missouri, and I'm sure many of them are weighing in with him and his office specifically about this legislation. So that groundwork is being laid, and if you get some favorable movement out of committee, perhaps a positive vote coming out of committee, that's when you engage the larger leadership, like Speaker Johnson in this instance.
Yeah. So you spent a bunch of time with this legislation a few years ago. Are there any funny or interesting or special stories as you paid attention to it and helped bring it together that you could share with the audience?
Well, just to show you how popular it really is, when I was stepping down and retiring, I had like 4 or 5 members come to me and say, hey, Ron, we'd really be interested in picking up this bill, from you, but they needed my blessing. And oh my God, the type of fight that took place so that they could be the new lead on the legislation because they believed it made so much sense and it was so important. So that was encouraging. But Man, I talk about a scrum.
Yeah.
When I was on the way out and trying to find a good desk for it to land on so that they could pick it up. And one of the reasons I picked Brad Schneider to take the lead after me was he's a serious member, very smart, knows this issue very, very well, and on the committee, which helps a lot. If you got the lead sponsor that's on the committee of jurisdiction. So he checked a lot of the right boxes, and I'm glad he has it now.
Yeah. Well, so we've talked a lot about what we think the legislation could do for the country, but you had a vision for it back when you originally introduced it. I'm curious, over the past few years, is that vision the same? Has it changed at all? What do you see? Like, what is your dream for how the country changes in ways that we haven't talked about if we can get this done?
Well, I think that the importance of this legislation has only been enhanced in light of that big bill they passed this summer because of the impact it's going to have, especially on rural healthcare providers. I know in my district, almost half the funding for these rural hospitals come from Medicaid reimbursements. You cut $1 trillion out of that program over the next 10 years. Of course, it's going to have a direct and immediate impact on our rural health providers, and in a bad way. I mean, like I said, we've had over 200 rural hospitals that have closed in the last 10 years alone. A lot of them are right on the cutting edge of surviving or not. If they don't survive, the only other solution is greater consolidation in the healthcare industry. You got these big healthcare systems that in many instances are partnering now with these rural providers, but if the rural providers themselves go away, these larger entities get even bigger. And then you have an imbalance when it comes to competition within the healthcare system. Whenever you have a monopoly, consumers lose. The more competition you have, consumers win, because that too is a check on these price forces in the marketplace. So that's a concern that I do have, is we've got to be doing more to support our rural healthcare providers. I used to co-chair the Rural Health Caucus in Congress along with Republican colleague Kathy McMorris Rogers from Washington State. And our task was to keep an eye on our rural providers, making sure they had a seat and, more importantly, a voice at the table when it came to considering these rural healthcare issues. And the pharmacists, I think, are going to play an important role in that as well, since many of them have a really close working relationship with these providers. But again, the point of contact and the access issue is going to be more important than ever going forward.
Yeah, well, we already know we have a provider shortage, and it could be getting worse. And so it's also a supply problem. There's just not enough supply there. And it's so frustrating because there's an army of these providers that are sitting on the sidelines saying, Coach, put me in, I want to help. And we're not letting them in, even though we've got a shortage. And so I think it's such an easy way to add to the supply and increase access and kind of everyone.
Yeah. And John, I'd always keep an eye too in regards to our pipeline for future pharmacists and whether or not we're making it easier or harder for them to go through all that education and training in order to become a pharmacist, along with the debt burden that many of them incur through their education expenses. And I was one of the leading voices of offering loan relief for future pharmacists, so they wouldn't have to carry that debt burden so far out into the future with them. And that too is another source of concern out there, is whether or not we're paying close enough attention to the pipeline, the future generation that need to step in and take over these positions. And that's basically true across the healthcare system right now.
Yeah. Well, it has been wonderful talking with you today. I can't thank you enough for getting us started here, starting off on the journey. Any last thoughts you have, or any other ideas you want to share with the audience before we wrap it up?
No, just other than it's easy to be discouraged about our political system today because a lot isn't working well. It shouldn't have to be this hard, but I can testify and certify today there are a lot of good-meaning representatives that are trying to do a good job, but they can only do as good a job as you'll enable them. And that means providing feedback to them. And this legislation, we talked about how important that pharmacy outreach to our policymakers, patient outreach to our policymakers are to get them focused. Because the name of the game in Congress is really about focus. There's so many things going on at the same time. So don't feel as if you're wasting your time in reaching out and weighing in on these issues.
Yeah. Well, that's a great sentiment to end on. Thank you again for joining us. Hopefully we can cross paths back in lacrosse and we both end up there again and our schedules align. Thanks again for joining me today, and join us again on our next episode of ECAPS Live.